So can I begin the session then by introducing Nika Elder, who's one of the organisers of the conference and Assistant Professor of Art History at American University in Washington, D.C. Nika specialises in North American art from the colonial period to the present, and is particularly interested in the politics of art that looks distinctly apolitical. Nika has published on contemporary artist Lorna Simpson in the Art Journal, 19th century painter William Harnett in the Archives of American Art, and is co-author with Diana Greenwald of a forthcoming piece about 18th century art patrons and enslavement in Winterthur Portfolio. She's currently completing a book about the rise of still life painting in the wake of the American Civil War, and starting a new project about John Singleton Copley and the transatlantic slave trade, from which her talk today derives. Nika's research has been supported by several fellowships and institutions in the US, most recently in 2018, a Chester Dale Fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So, Fugitive, Pigments, Painting and Race in the British Atlantic.
Thank you all for being here today. I also regret that Cheryl won't be here today as my interlocutor, but I would encourage you all to consult her book, her articles, which are fascinating. And before I begin, I also wanted to thank my wonderful co-organizer, Kate Roach, who it has just been a dream to work with from beginning to end. In 1771, Sir Joshua Reynolds delivered his fourth discourse to students at the recently founded Royal Academy of the Arts. It began, quote, "The value and rank of every art is in proportion to the mental labor employed in it or the mental pleasure produced by it," end quote. With this statement, Reynolds codified and institutionalized prevailing sentiment in England about the hierarchy of genres. Depictions of important biblical, mythological, and literary stories or military feats, history painting occupied the preeminent position on the scale. And still life painting, which Reynolds and others perceived as pure imitation, occupied the lowest. Yet despite the primacy he granted to history painting, Reynolds and many of the students he mentored, John Singleton Copley among them, dedicated most of their time and energy to portraiture. Scholars of British art have offered several explanations for the Academy's values, its members' professional preoccupations, and to an extent, the disparity between them. In large part, these explanations have centered on issues of class. So Reynolds' discourses and the genres negotiated changing conceptions of private and public life amidst an evolving upper class comprised of both landed gentry and a growing mercantile elite. Or, like the government, the Academy responded to growing antagonisms between the upper and working classes by reaffirming traditional values, and in the case of the arts, audiences too. More recent art historical scholarship has, of course, attended to empire and located British art within its global contexts. This important work has explored the ways in which history, painting, landscape, and visual culture in general have depicted colonized peoples and places. Yet, as is widely acknowledged, portraiture was the dominant genre during the First British Empire. My talk today builds upon recent scholarship on British art and imperialism to detail the ways in which portraits of white sitters served the logic of empire too. To do so, it swerves away from Reynolds and the British Isle to John Singleton Copley, one of his most devoted colonial acolytes, and through him locates the British taste for portraiture within the context of the transatlantic slave trade. My focus will be these three portraits of the royal family, and always good to note not to be confused with the royal family. Isaac Royal's professional profile is typical of Copley's colonial sitters. He was a wealthy merchant of unspecified goods whose New England home was the site of, quote, lavish parties. as the Copley in America catalog describes the events his family hosted. Indeed, the catalog speaks much of Royal's hospitality and generosity, but like the Prown catalog raisonné on which it was based, makes no mention of the enslaved laborers in the Royal's home or the existence of the transatlantic slave trade in general. In point of fact, though, the Royals were the largest slaveholders in colonial Massachusetts. Their estate was known as Ten Hills Farm, and in 1739, its enslaved population already numbered 38 people and only grew over time. These individuals cooked and cleaned and sewed, but also planted and harvested crops, hunted and fished, cut trees, and tended livestock on the 500-acre estate. As with Copley's other colonial portraits, his paintings of the Royals betray no explicit sign of the family's engagement with slavery or the slave trade. There are no black pages like those seen in these mainland portraits of the family of Sir William Young on the left and the portrait of the Duchess Ormond on the right. Only Mary's small hummingbird, which was native to Antigua, subtly alludes to the Royals' Caribbean roots and so to their economic stakes in the region. Otherwise, as with the rest of Copley's portraits, the paintings depict white sitters in smart clothing. Scholarship on Copley has, in large part, focused on the sitter's clothing and explored the important functions that it served. His sitter's sumptuous garments reaffirmed gender roles. They announced the sitter's wealth and status, be that status real or aspirational. And as Margaretta Lovell has deftly argued, they registered and announced the subject's social networks and political loyalties. All of these accounts, while fascinating and true, also overlook the very foundation of these portraits, namely the white bodies that sport these garments. Given that the works are portraits, this aspect of them may appear negligible, but it warrants examination given the preponderance of portraiture at this time and changing perceptions and articulations of the body in the final quarter of the 18th century. Reading the royal portraits in relation to these visual and verbal discourses, I'll argue that as much as Copley used clothing to define his sitters in terms of gender and class, he also depicted Caucasian flesh in ways that constructed whiteness as a type and an inheritance. While history paintings pictured, among other things, military exploits and foreign locales across the British Empire, portraiture addressed and assuaged the racial anxieties that attended colonization. Its sitters embodied whiteness and thereby affirmed its presumed biological origins and bolstered its embattled virility. Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Royal are typical of Copley's portraits of the colonial elite. Isaac sits on a chair turned away from his desk, but points back at its surface, which is littered with papers that are illegible to the viewer. Elizabeth McIntosh, as his wife was known before they were married, is comfortably seated in a plush chair against a classical landscape. Despite the differences in their clothing and poses, though, both Isaac and Elizabeth's bodies register as palpable human flesh. Their heads and hands are vividly substantive and yet soft. And through highlight and shade, as well as touches of red and blue, Copley has painstakingly modeled paint to achieve the color of Caucasian skin. As scholars commonly note, Copley was the first colonial artist to produce such dramatically three-dimensional figures, and his innovations become clear when comparing his portraits of Isaac and Elizabeth to an earlier painting of the royal family in which the couple also appears. Below is Robert Feake's Isaac Royal and Family. Isaac stands at the right edge of Feake's canvas, and Mary is seated to his right, holding their first child, who passed away the year after they all sat for the portrait. And Mary and Isaac's respective sisters complete the composition. Feake's figures have dimension to them, but they lack the verity of Copley's portraits. Their bodies read as hard alabaster sculptures rather than organic human tissue. The fleshiness of Copley's portraits was in fact hard won. Whereas Sir Joshua Reynolds asked 5 to 8 hours with a subject, Copley was known to have sitters come to his studio multiple times for hours at a time. And this is his famous portrait of Mrs. Daniel Sargent, who complained in a letter to her son that she had to go to Copley's studio about 15 or 16 times, 6 hours at a time to complete this work. In the first textbook devoted to American art, William Dunlap reveals why Copley may have required so many sittings. Quote, "When painting a portrait, he used to match with his palette knife a tint for every part of the face, whether in light, shadow, or reflection. This occupied himself and the sitter a long time before he touched the canvas," end quote. Conservator William Shank's 1984 technical study of Copley's work bears out Dunlap's claim about the artist's technique. Exploring the paint layers of the Harvard University Nicholas Boylston, which you see on the screen, Shank writes, quote, "Light and dark areas of flesh and draperies are laid in side by side rather than one above the other," end quote. My recent conversation with conservators at Harvard reveals other strategies that may also be at play. Considering Copley's work in comparison to Feek's royal family portrait, they suppose that Copley likely built up his canvases in thin, translucent layers. Writing in the first installment of American Painters on Technique, conservators Lance Mayer and Gay Myers echo this sentiment. Based on Copley's letters, they suggest he used varnish to, quote, "make smooth transitions in flesh tones," end quote. A common practice in Britain at the time, this technique also caused surfaces to yellow and was a constant source of frustration for Copley, who experimented with adding oil and varnish to his paints in order to forestall the degradation of his flesh tones. Whether the artist worked in layers or patches, or perhaps both, Copley was clearly more concerned with rendering flesh and with the quality and permanence of its coloring than other colonial artists had been before him. We can, in part, attribute this concern to Copley's professional ambitions and his practice of emulating masters like Sir Joshua Reynolds. And here I'm putting up this comparison to show the way in which Copley has so clearly borrowed the composition for Mrs. Jareth Mail Bowers from Reynolds's Lady Caroline Russell on the right. But as much as Copley modeled his compositions after paintings of the British aristocracy, his portraits also sought to distinguish their bodies, both in terms of color and quality, from the enslaved population in the United States. Given that Copley and his colonial sitters were based in New England, far from the deep South, scholars haven't considered how slavery may have impacted their respective careers. In point of fact, though, over 50% of Copley's patrons, not to mention the artist himself, enslaved laborers, traded enslaved peoples, or otherwise trafficked in the goods that they produced. And here I'm using this colonial map as a placeholder for the work that Diana Greenwald and I are doing to chart the relationships that all 240 of Copley's colonial patrons had with the slave trade. Indeed, in the 1770s, Boston was one of the largest and most active ports in the colonies. As such, not despite their location in Boston, but precisely because of it, both Copley and his patrons would have been particularly attuned to and even invested in the ways in which Anglo-American culture was coming to understand corporeal difference at this time. From antiquity and well into the 19th century, philosophers believed the climate and its impact upon the humors accounted for the variety of skin colors and civilizations across the globe. The two Goltzius prints on the screen exhibit and illustrate this belief. Created in the 16th century, they come from the printmaker's four-part allegory of the continents. In these works, nudes representative of Africa and America, respectively, sit on animals at the center of each print. But the differences in terrain, flora, and fauna are what actually characterize each continent. The bodies are relatively the same, it is the settings that are different. But in the 1770s, in the midst of the Enlightenment and at the apogee of the slave trade, this environmental and organic model of human difference gave way to a rigid and inflexible racial hierarchy attributed to biology, anatomy, and the physical body writ large. Indeed, the surest evidence of this new corporeal understanding of race is the portraits that were made in the midst of it. And on the screen, I've paired Copley's painting of Isaac Royal with a runaway slave advertisement that circulated a few years prior. Of course, a runaway slave advertisement was not valued like a portrait, but as a verbal description of a specific person, it certainly was supposed to function like one. Written and circulated by slaveholders in an attempt to retrieve their self-stolen property, these advertisements were among the most common elements of pre-revolutionary American visual culture, particularly from the 1750s through the 1770s, when Copley was at his colonial height. As Copley's paintings and these advertisements respectively described white and black bodies, they also helped construct two distinct and opposed racial types. The runaway slave advertisement on the screen comes from the Boston Gazette. A man named Lodowick Updike wrote and placed it after one of his enslaved laborers, Demas, ran away from Updike's New England estate in 1763. In an attempt to locate Demas, Updike described him as follows: ran away from the subscriber at North Kingstown in the colony of Rhode Island. A young Negro man named Demas, born in this country, well set, has a down look, thin-jawed, and a visible scar from the bridge of his nose over his cheek, reaching beyond the corner of his mouth. He had on, when he absconded, a new jacket and breeches of snuff-colored broadcloth, trimmed with horn buttons. His jacket is double-breasted, has a long, low-brimmed hat, and affects the sailor. He is a subtle, artful fellow, and has got a forged pass. The advertisement tells us little about Demas. We learn roughly where he was born and the name Updike had likely given him. The advertisement also describes the clothing he had on and Demas's attitude and comportment as Updike perceived them. But overall, it provides almost no information that might distinguish Demas from other young black men, the only exception being Demas's scar, which Updike or a previous master had likely inflicted upon him. Unsurprisingly, ads like this one rarely located the individuals they ostensibly described. What they did do, however, is define blackness as deviant and reinforce this perception on a regular basis. Indeed, through these advertisements, the black subject only becomes visible as an individual through the act of running away. While today we can understand runaway slave advertisements as an archive of resistance, at the time, they, like the scar on Demas's face, were evidence of truancy. They replaced flesh with records of misbehavior. Whereas runaway slave advertisements did not visualize their subjects, Copley's white sitters both command and orchestrate the viewer's gaze. We, of course, look at them, but they also tell us where to look. Isaac holds a stack of folded papers, maybe letters or deeds, and points at his desk. Elizabeth Royal is pictured in order to be looked at, and Mary and Elizabeth display their pet's obedience and thereby their own. For the preeminent 18th century philosopher George Berkeley, visibility was the essence of human consciousness. Scholars Ann Gibson and Lucia Palmer succinctly summarize his treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge as follows, quote, "To exist might be the same as to perceive and to be perceived," end quote. Scholars have explored the ways in which Berkeley's theories informed Copley's investment in observation and his approach to pictorial space. But the philosopher's ideas also would have informed the artist's understanding of humanity itself. It was a function of sight and the ability to be both its subject and its object. In a colonial economy in which enslaved people were often prohibited from looking at free whites and only became visible as individuals when running away, Copley's portraits take on important racial significance. They make explicit the assumptions latent in Berkeley's text. As the royals point, pose, and perform, the paintings collapse notions about the human body as a sensorium and whiteness into one. Each becomes a facet of the other. Scholars have done much important work to decipher how representations of the enslaved, be they advertisements like the one for Demas on the right, or prints like this mezzotint of the Duchess of Ormond on the left, helped construct modern understandings of race. Both of these images, one an object of ephemera, the other an emissary of the fine arts, framed blackness as delinquent and deviant. But portraits of white sitters, like Copley's paintings of the royal family, served a comparable and equally insidious role. As much as they characterized their subjects in terms of gender and class, they also constructed whiteness as a type. In his third discourse, Reynolds addresses the depiction of the human form. He acknowledges some variability within the species, although he doesn't specify its terms, and argues that, quote, in each of these classes, there is one common idea and central form, which is the abstract of the various individual forms belonging to that class, end quote. Art historian John Barrell has explored the ways in which this dictate helped constitute a public at a time of growing mercantile activity. But Copley's paintings and their place within the broader visual culture of the Massachusetts colony reveals the racial implications of this claim. As he assiduously completed portrait commission after portrait commission, Copley framed whiteness as an identity, but also an inheritance. Each sitter was an instance of this presumed class, and each portrait was evidence of its vitality. Isaac Royal commissioned Copley's paintings to hang in the family's stately home in Medford, Massachusetts, which you see on the screen. And it's actually open as a museum today, so it's possible to go visit it. The main house is in the upper left there, and that's an interior shot on the right. And then those are the slave quarters below. We don't know the precise location in which the portraits hung, but the so-called best room or parlor at the front of the house seems like a good bet. This room is where the royals spent time as a family and where they entertained guests. But as such, it is also one of the rooms in which enslaved men, women, and children cleaned and served. Each of these audiences would have experienced the royal portraits in different ways. And in the interest of time today, I'll focus on the ways in which the portraits signified to the royals and to their guests. But in the Q&A, which we will have ample time for, we can talk about how the enslaved people within the home may have interacted with these portraits too. Until 1737, the family lived in Antigua, where Isaac's father owned a sugar plantation. In that year, as the plantation's enslaved population mobilized to rebel, the royals fled to Medford, where Isaac had been born. Isaac Royal's father brought 27 enslaved men, women, and children with him. And by 1739, so just 2 years later, the enslaved population on the estate had risen to 38 individuals. And this helpful chart comes from an archaeological study of Ten Hills Farm, which is the estate where the royals lived, and it tracks the tenure of the people who were enslaved there. The growing population meant additional hands to serve the household and tend the estate, but it also outpaced the royal family itself and would have reinvigorated concerns about rebellion. So we're calling here that they both fled Antigua on account of oncoming uprising, but also that some of their young children had passed away earlier in their lives. Within this context, Copley's double portrait of Mary and Elizabeth, an anomaly in his oeuvre, testified to their parents' fertility. His pendant portraits of Isaac and Elizabeth McIntosh underscored the reproductive nature of the couple's union, and the three paintings as a whole visualized their immediate family tree and its virility. Copley was notoriously frustrated with his patrons' demand for portraits. About 1767, in a letter to either Benjamin West or Copley's transatlantic go-between, Captain Bruce, the artist famously described the colonies as follows, quote, "Was it not for preserving the resemblance of particular persons, painting would not be known in the place. The people generally regard it no more than any other useful trade, as they sometimes term it, like that of a carpenter, tailor, or shoemaker, not as one of the most noble arts in the world," end quote. Copley imagined things were different in England. But while Reynolds championed history painting, he too primarily engaged in portraiture. The racial significance of Copley's colonial portraits provides new insight into this famous disjuncture and the hierarchy of genres in general. It was not strictly a function of class anxieties, but also the broader colonial conquests, the imperialism that occasioned them. During the British Empire, as the state worked to assert its dominion over territories in the so-called New World, the hierarchy of genres helped justify its efforts. While history paintings like The Death of General Wolfe pictured military exploits and colonial expansion, portraiture helped construct and promulgate the racial ideology that sustained it. Paintings of the British elite and colonial sitters who aspired to their stature not only asserted their class position, they also asserted and affirmed their racial identity. Today, whiteness gains power through its invisibility as the assumed norm, but in the 18th century, the opposite was true. In White, cultural theorist Richard Dyer writes, quote, "Before the middle of the 20th century, few white people seem to have hesitated to call themselves white and to speak of belonging to the white race," end quote. British portraiture helped bolster this inherently unstable category. Works by Copley and Reynolds pictured preternaturally white skin and the sensory experiences it was thought to afford. But as with runaway slave advertisements, their subject was a moving target. Thank you.